I'm interested in some of the other members of the department besides faculty and students. I know when I arrived, we still had a glass blower in the department, though with time it seemed like his duties were not needed. Was that an important person in the department at one time?
Yes, before the commercial companies that provided ground glassware thrived, that was a good way of getting glassware made for your research with ground glass joints.
Ah, so that you couldn't buy commercially simple flasks with ground glass joints or other
Or
equipment?
more complicated things
Yeah.
with ground glass joints.
Mm-hmm. How about the
Yeah, that was true for the organic group.
as
For
well?
years there were glass blowing needs that kept that man pretty busy.
Yeah, we had George Prince was our glass blower, and you had to bribe him with a bottle of scotch once in a while to get things done fast. It worked well.
But I do remember that as the years progressed, and this was a fairly rapid thing, wasn't it, for the commercial companies to get in there and make any number of things that
That's right.
formerly you would need prints to make for you.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the glass catalogs as they developed. Yeah,
And at
you
one
could buy
time,
everything.
yeah, at one time we also had a fairly large stockroom with chemicals and solvents. Is that right?
For a long time,
I
actually.
think we did.
The solvent stockroom, as I recall, was on the end of the Dreyfus building closest to 56.
Yes, I'm not even remembering that at all well.
And
But we didn't nowadays. I guess you just have to. Each group has to order it as
That's
they
right.
need it.
Yeah. And did we have any other shops besides
Well,
glass
we
blowing?
had a machine shop. What was the name of the man that would collect all kinds of scrap metal and things, and he'd sell that, and then he would. Did he have a party for people down in the basement? I should remember his name. I didn't have much reason to call on him for needs, but
Mhm.
but what was he make? Would he
I
make
forget
metal
his
working
name, yeah.
things? The physical chemist might have a better
Mhm.
perspective on that.
Johnny.
Yeah.
I remember his first name. Johnny and his Christmas party. Yes.
And
I imagine. Do we have a machine shop now?
I don't believe so. Not staffed by a person providing service. And what about what's now called the DCIF, Department of Chemistry Instrumentation facility, where the NMR instruments, mass spec instruments are? I know when I arrived in the late 70s, I think it was Dan Traficante
Yes,
who
we had
was in
Dan,
charge of
yeah.
that. Do you recall when that was a service facility where where we had departmental instruments? When did we first acquire in the department instruments for use by the department, NMR and mass spec
Well, I would
instruments?
imagine that was pretty early in the NMR and mass spec, times. For example, no NMRs when I was in graduate school or at UCLA as a postdoc. When I came back and started at MIT, NMR was just too new. I do remember Rockow at Harvard was in the NMR when I was a graduate
When
student.
I came to MIT, John Waugh ran my NMRs, or one of his students.
But they became so important to organic chemistry and probably all branches of chemistry that the machines were so expensive that was certainly the origin of that term you used. What was it? The D.
Well, the spectroscopy lab now is called DCIF, Instrumentation.
So that just from the standpoint of expense, we'd have to make joint proposals to the NSF or maybe other departmental government agencies.
The way it is now, of course.
And then you would get more than one down there, and they increased in complexity and importance. Just just almost year by year, you'd be constantly needing to apply to the government for funds to buy these
Sure.
really expensive machines.
So of course, a big part of the responsibilities of faculty involves teaching, both graduate and particularly undergraduate students. I'm curious as to what teaching assignments were like back in the 1950s and 60s. What was the typical teaching load? Nowadays, faculty normally are sharing a semester class if it's a big lecture class, and many of our graduate subjects are only half a semester. So I would say in the department, probably the normal teaching load is to be teaching for one half of a semester. How does that compare to the situation when you arrived at MIT and how it evolved over the years?
In inorganic, we had more teaching. We generally taught for a semester, and then it changed to the half a semester, as you said, yeah.
So at one time, a class like 503 inorganic would be an assignment for one faculty member.
That's right. Well, we didn't have that many faculty, so.
Yeah, sure. How about the big general chemistry classes? Were they taught by one person or shared?
Well, I got put into freshman chemistry, which was run by Clark Stevenson.
Right at the start?
Right at the start.
Oh.
And so I ran a freshman section, which was good practice for me. I had to learn how to do all these calculations again, which I hadn't done for some 5 years. And so it was a lot of fun, but I was in freshman chemistry for a couple of years.
That was probably 501?
501,
Yeah.
501, 502.
Mm-hmm.
The famous, it was a good course. It was a great course, I thought. And then Al Cotton was teaching inorganic chemistry, and he was writing his famous book, Cotton and Wilkinson, which became used throughout the country and also internationally. And first year he taught from it, I had one semester on the main group chemistry, and he taught the transition metal chemistry. And so we tried it out, and it worked quite well. So I had contact with the graduate students that way, and was able to pick up graduate students and grow my group. But Cotton was very nice to work with. He was very enthusiastic. He was obviously very bright, very good, very driven. He wrote another book on group theory at about the same time, which was also well received.
How much senior to you was he then?
He had arrived in 55.
Mm-hmm. And that was but he was a beginning professor in 55, so only 2 years.
Right,
Wow.
2 years difference.
So inorganic chemistry really had a meteoric rise at MIT when the two of you joined the department within a couple of years.
That's right. That's when the old timers retired. Shum retired and Young retired. And so they were gone. And so Al and I had run of the show, run of things.
Who was the next inorganic chemist to be hired?
Alan Davison.
And what year do you think that might have been roughly?
2 or 3 years later.
Uh-huh.
He was at Harvard too as an instructor. And so he was persuaded to come to MIT as an assistant professor. He was a great colleague. That was a great group we had for a while there.
Yeah. Did you have a big staff of teaching assistants?
Yeah, we had a lot of teaching. And Clark Stevenson was in charge of the teaching assistants.
A faculty member was
and
in
the
charge.
lab, yeah. And running the lab.
So the lab was actually linked to the lecture course?
Oh, yes.
Oh, that's a big difference, of course. Was there one grade for the combination?
I think so, yes.
For the organic courses, since the, and we're now talking about the thing before the Zacharias committee and the changes in the core for
That's
MIT.
correct.
But if we're talking about that period, which ran from 53 when I started there until 65 thereabouts, that we were really not involved with the 501 course, although there was one time when, and the 501 had many small sections. Dietmar would be giving a big lecture, but then you would have TAs that ran tutorial sessions,
That's right.
recitation sections with groups of 15, 20,
which is
20
still, of course, the way those classes operate. But I'm fascinated by the idea that you had a class with hundreds of first-year students also doing a laboratory,
That's what it
because
was there.
all
That's
of our
right.
discussions in the last few decades about introducing a laboratory component for first-year students, the answer has been, well, there's no possibility of finding a facility, the place for that number of students. And so how did we accommodate so many in a laboratory?
Oh, we had more laboratory space.
That was in building
Building
2?
building
Oh.
2 and building 4.
So there must have been quite a large amount of real estate
That's
allocated to that.
In any event, the organic faculty were not involved with that 501, with 1 year where the administration wanted more faculty as opposed to teaching assistants running some of these discussion recitation sections. So Cope had all of the younger organic people running a section of the 501. And so I learned some more inorganic chemistry when I did it for
When you say a section, do you mean the recitation?
the recitation
Recitation,
sections.
yeah.
The administration wanted more faculty representation in the teaching of these
Mhm.
recitation sections rather than leaving it 100% in the hands of the entering graduate students, which was the only other answer for that. But for the teaching of the organic course, 1 year of organic, 541, 542, in that period, 1953 up until the late 60s, how many students would we have in those? Quite a lot. There might have been 200, because they would be the people majoring in chemistry, majoring in biology, and maybe some other people. Any pre-med, of course, had to be in it. But so that those courses, I think, were not shared in that period. One person would lecture the whole fall or the whole spring for that. I could be wrong. I don't remember at what point they started to be co-taught, but as they became larger classes, then it was a lot of work to stay on top of the whole thing. We'd have many TAs in it, because those courses also were taught in terms of teaching assistants running sections of 15 to 20 people. Would they be that many people in the section?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Mhm.
And so that's the way that was. But
Well,
I'd
you
say,
had somebody else to run the teaching assistants.
yeah,
in
you'd have a
the
head
lab.
TA.
That was Clark Stevenson, who was a professor of physical chemistry.
Right.
And we would always need a head TA, hopefully somebody who had already been at the level earlier.
In recent years, the evolution of research has made many programs very interdisciplinary, and that has led to the blurring of the divisions between different areas of chemistry. How rigid were those divisions back in the 50s and 60s? That is, were the organic, inorganic, physical chemists really distinct?
Well, I took a lot of organic chemists into my group for a while.
Students, grad students.
Grad students. In fact, I moved over to the new building because I had a group that was half organic, half inorganic. And I preferred to be with the organic chemists for a while. Later, when my research changed back to mostly inorganic. I moved back with the inorganic chemists.
Mm-hmm. Were you also attending meetings of organic chemists and faculty lunches and so on that the organic
Yeah,
chemists held? Yeah.
that's right. And I was on student thesis committees, organics
Mhm.
student thesis committees. So I took part, yes.
Yeah. Were
But
there
you
any
were-
other? I'm sorry, go ahead, Fred.
No,
I was just going to ask if there were any other faculty who similarly sort of had a foot in two camps.
well, when I'm asking myself, let's say people like Schrock, who did a lot of work with organic systems one way or another, I don't
And
think
mostly inorganic chemists.
I would have never even known that he was being considered. I would have known what he was. In other words, at such point as you people hired Schrock, I think the organic group didn't need to know about that until somebody in the inorganic said we ought to hire this person, probably went through this appointments committee, and then we would learn about it. So that I think in the appointments area, even for, well, no, I think that the divisions are pretty separate in terms of their teaching responsibilities and in terms of their exams, their cumulative exams. But in terms of other functions, you'd have to remind me, Dietmar, if you think of things where there was a blurring between responsibilities of inorganic chemist of the faculty and their organic.
Well, I never had to teach organic courses, thank goodness.
But I think you mentioned, Fred, that John Deutsch taught chemistry with you one year.
He taught that first semester of course that Dan Kemp put together. One of those years that I taught it, John Deutsch and he taught the first half of it, which was a more structure and bonding and parts of that. In one lecture, and he would usually hand out notes about what he would be lecturing about. Would I do that? Can't remember, and that'll be a digression at the moment. But there was one lecture when John Deutsch was lecturing on, and in 10 to 50, you wore some kind of amplifying system with a long cord. And you will remember 26100 has a very long blackboard space. And so here's the big John Deutsch up there on the thing with this thing in this super long cord stretching. And he's lecturing on a topic that was a difficult topic. And he was not doing this in a way that the students were able to follow what he was doing, even though they had some notes of it. And so there's a sort of a noise springing up in the class. They're not getting this, and it's getting a little louder and a little louder, and John Deutsch is going on speaking. Then John Deutsch stops cold. And he realizes that he's not reaching these people with it. He starts over and just in new words starts explaining the whole thing in an understandable way. And I was very impressed with that, because it was the kind of thing where the class could have gotten really out of hand. But John Deutsch assessed that these people were not understanding the topic the way he was giving it, and he went back to a much lower kind of standard of words or ways of explaining the same topic. And it was really impressive. It was fun to watch it. But I do have this picture of John up there with this great big long cord thrashing around.
So at various times we've alluded to chemists in the department who were nuclear chemists as their specialty or analytical chemists. Those are areas of research that are no longer, and for a long time have not been, part of the department. And of course, currently biological chemistry, or we're now calling it chemical biology, is a big component of research in the department. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how we phased out nuclear and analytical and how biological chemistry became a significant part of the department.
Well, Dietmar,
Well, those were all major appointments made by Cope.
Hmm.
Cope came in and hired Hume to be the analytical chemist and Coriel to be the nuclear radiochemist,
Mm-hmm.
with Jack Irving coming at the same time. But they didn't grow, and nationwide, well, not nationwide, but in many universities, analytical chemistry was getting downplayed, and so was nuclear chemistry. And MIT just went along with this.
But I remember a faculty meeting that was dealing with really with those questions. And I was not sure whether the nuclear thing was something that where you made a separation even prior to the meeting I'm talking about. But the one was what was with regard to analytical chemistry and nuclear chemistry. And Cotton was at that meeting, and John Waugh. They were both outspokenly opposed to considering nuclear chemistry as part of the chemistry department. They said that's second-rate physics, and we shouldn't be going in that direction. Cotton, both of those people in particular, were ones who at that meeting said we certainly should be pushing in the direction of biology. There's no discussion even about analytical. Everybody agreed that analytical as a research area was, if there's important things to do in that area, they would be picked up by the physical chemists or the inorganic chemists or the organic chemists, but we wouldn't have a separate teaching of analytical chemistry. But for the nuclear, I didn't know very much about that or what was going on. I learned much more from Dietmar in these sessions than I knew before. But I remember that as an important meeting at which we're not going to be involved with nuclear chemistry, and we were going to push towards the biochemistry. Which we proceeded to do. I don't know the timing about this too well, but as I mentioned earlier this afternoon, when we hired Chris Walsh, he was hired as a member of the organic department, the organic division, and I don't know how long thereafter they kind of. I think of him as one of the early ones in that. Am I wrong about that? Were there some other strongly bio? You mentioned what Paul Schimmel perhaps was even earlier than that.
Yes.
And I would guess that he was also an organic division person, wouldn't he have been?
So there were real divisions in that case.
There were real divisions of organic division, the physical division, and the inorganic division. And the inorganic was coupled with the nuclear,
Mm-hmm.
an unwelcome combination. And then analytical.
Mm-hmm.
We got rid of the analytical without any discussion. We really moved away from the nuclear. Subjectively, I associated that with that faculty meeting where Cotton spoke out strongly against the nuclear and strongly in favor of bio, as did John Waugh. They were both pretty prominent people in the department, and it didn't take really much discussion for the rest of the faculty to favor going that route, which probably many of them were already oriented towards anyway.
Well, with regard to graduate students and admissions, something we've talked about a little, how did that then figure into this evolution of some organic faculty into being regarded as biological? Were the first hires then taking students that were organic but doing research that was more biological?
Oh, I would think so.
How about the teaching in terms of the curriculum?
Well, I think in the teaching, I sat in on the course that Chris Walsh taught, and I don't know whether it might have been early in his point, and then he wrote notable textbook on it. It was, I guess, that course. What did we do? I think we called it 507. I don't remember Chris teaching, being part of the faculty teaching the organic courses. So I think we were, it must have been sort of coincided with starting to teach things in the biochemistry direction. If I looked back at the catalog, I guess I would answer my questions about that, but I haven't done that.
Anything that has changed or that's interesting to relate concerning name lectureships and visiting faculty?
Well, I would like to say a couple of words about that. When I started at MIT in 1953, and it may have not started until the following year, the Arthur D. Little Company must have given a big chunk to the MIT department for Arthur D. Little lectureship. The unusual thing about that compared to anything going on now that I know of is that people would accept an appointment to come to MIT for a period of upwards of 6 weeks. That's my sort of recollection about it.
You could stay a whole semester, actually.
Maybe a whole term. And the I think the first person that I knew, and maybe the first person who started this, was Lord Todd at the University of Cambridge in England. And Cope had invited him to come over. So he gave a fascinating series of lectures over many weeks. Did you go to any of those?
Well, I wasn't here in 53.
You weren't here, right, for 54. And then some of the others in that Arthur D. Little lectureship series were Albert Eschenmoser from ETH in Switzerland, a great guy to have in the department. We didn't really have much day-to-day interaction with Lord Todd, although it just sort of was out of our class, I think, to do that. But Eschenmoser was in the lab frequently with us, and they gave these a grand series of lectures.
What year was this?
Well,
Roughly?
I think 54 I know was Todd. And I don't know the sequence of the other ones, but the names that I remember were Albert Eschenmoser. He, of course, had close ties to Woodward in his research on B12.
Well, of course, Buchey was close to him.
And with Buchey. Derek Barton came and gave a fantastic series of lectures on all these new things he was synthesizing, probably 2 lectures a week for many weeks. And who else was in that? Todd Eschenmoser, Derek Barton came for one of those. E.R.H. Jones, professor, head of the department at Oxford, came over and again spent weeks at MIT. And there's somebody from Sweden. What's his name? Silen?
Silen, yes.
But those are the only names that sort of came back to me. But I guess the thing that is striking about it is that in these subsequent years, people just don't take a whole block of a semester to go someplace and to be a lecturer, sort of week in, week out. They might go for a week. They might go for a few days. But can you think of any place where
Cornell, Caltech have visiting lectureships like that last a semester, yeah.
And I don't know what happened to the Arthur D. Little lectureship.
It's a physical chemistry name lecture, usually two lectures,
still have
2 to 3 days.
Anyway, those were a very interesting addition to some of my earlier years there at MIT.
I don't know if you've been to Kendall Square in MIT recently, but anyone who visits will see it's being transformed with several new large buildings that are owned and being built by MIT, though they won't be all MIT occupied. And I know people who even visited a few years ago say it's hardly recognizable. Well, imagine the shock they would have if they would see pictures of the way MIT was back in the 1960s and even into the 1970s. Could you tell us a little bit about what Kendall Square was like?
when I started in 1953, the Lever brothers had two mammoth soap producing facilities.
Soap.
Soap.
Ah.
The Lever brothers made soap facilities for making soap. Not really where the Draper building now is, but sort of, if Draper building is here and MIT is here, there's a big area there. I don't know what it's called. It's sort of headed towards Central Square, but much closer to MIT. It was all with the soap producing facility. Another big change was when, I guess, Kennedy was president, and there was going to be this huge NASA project, and much of the Kendall Square area was bought up by the government, and they did build one building, but then I think the economy turned sour. That building got turned over to the Transportation Department. I don't know what
That's
was
correct.
up there, but it's quite a ways away from MIT.
Well,
But all of that intermediate area was small businesses. And then then Kennedy is assassinated, and Lyndon Johnson has the NASA thing moved to Houston through Congress, and so there was some years gap in there. I think it was the economy as well as the departure or the disappearance of Kennedy from the scene. But then over these years, it's astonishing all these changes that have gone on in that whole Kendall Square area. I suppose more rapidly over the last 15, 20 years. What would be your impression of that?
Yeah.
Or yours?
Polaroid was still in the vicinity.
mm-hmm.
In fact, hired many MIT graduates.
You were mentioning at some point about, what was it, the F&T Diner over near the fire station?
Yeah.
Well, now there's, I think, innumerable places for fine dining in Kendall Square. It's an excellent restaurant scene, but when I was a student at Harvard and came down occasionally, the only place that I recall to eat was this F&T Diner. Was that popular among the faculty?
No.
I was over there frequently. If I was
Dietmar had better taste.
Well, I was there from time to time. Frequently is probably the wrong word.
You could do better going to Central Square.
And sometimes I think, it seemed to me that Walker was open evenings, and I would eat there. But in terms of the changes, the fire station also ultimately was closed as a fire station, and then I guess it turned into a hotel, and which it still is.
Relatively
And I remember
recently, yeah.
making arrangements for one visiting lecturer, and he, that's where he wanted to stay, wanted to be in the place where the fire station was.
Yeah. So, aside from the Lever brothers, most of the area that we now know as Kendall Square was basically vacant shells of buildings that were industrial, big lots that were empty for parking.
And we've mentioned some other things that were were not MIT things on Ames Street, the building 17, 18, and 19, which was what the candy factory.
Daggett, oh, that was nice. That
And
smelled good.
And the car fastener building that was across the street from it, and which then was bought by MIT and turned into the biology building. And then MIT finally got permission from the town of Cambridge to put an underground passageway between the underneath Ames Street, and that was
Underneath Mass Avenue, even.
Did they ever do that?
No, we don't have under Mass Ave. They've blocked
Didn't?
that. We
No,
wish
no
that
walkway
was
under
possible.
That, but this walkway, they had to wait quite a while before Cambridge agreed
That's
to let
right,
them
yeah.
go under Ames Street. But that's handy. You can go from the subway to the chemistry building and never be outside. But about all these other structures, I guess it's just a booming, you know, bio area, isn't it?
Chemistry never occupied any of the other buildings, I guess. For example, Building 20 is the famous building where the radar
Yeah.
development was carried out during the Second World War. That's now the site of the Stata Center.
And I was happy to see that, and this is not a new thing, that when the Stata building was put up, that they have a whole corner of it associated with that, what went on in that Building 20, the radar work, so that although it was a little too bad, but necessary for that wooden building to come down, the history of it is preserved in that one corner, first floor of the Stata building.
And not only that, but they have extensive use of plywood in the public areas on the first floor to commemorate Building 20, which was erected out of plywood as a temporary structure in the 1940s. Anything else with regard to the physical plant of MIT that people might be interested in, looking back at the way things have evolved over the years?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of new structures. I guess I was quite impressed by the fact that from where I was in 2215, when I first came to MIT, which was at the second floor junction between buildings 2 and 6, and then my office was there. It looked out on that completely enclosed courtyard.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that some years later they built another big building inside that courtyard, lifting everything up over the Eastman part of the campus. I thought that was an impressive achievement.
Yes, that's an extension of the physics department, the infill building that takes up half of that interior courtyard.
And then this new building, what is it, the nano?
Building 12 is the nano building. That's where the undergraduate
But that was
teaching
easier
labs
to
are.
build because at least had direct access in to do that. But
Well, I'd like to thank both of you, Dietmar, Fred, for this very interesting recollection of the way the department has been and how it's evolved to our current state. Appreciate your time and want to thank you on behalf of all of the students, faculty, and other alumni who I'm sure will find this fascinating to watch.
and many thanks to you, Rick, and also to Liz and to Emric for making these things happen here. And greatly to you, Dietmar, for your hospitality here in your home.